Hello there, YouTube. And hello, Michael Tackets. Yes, I do know you've seen some of my videos because you've left comments, but otherwise, hello, I'm Ian, I'm Darth, as a brush on here. I would have put my real name on, but I don't particularly want a Google Plus account, so yes, that's how that system works, and it's rather irritating. So yes, I would happily display my real name here, but alas, the problem is it'll give you a free Google Plus account. I don't want a Google Plus account. I can go fuck off. Anyway, that's a tangent. You wanted to start some fun, and here's some fun. Like you, I'm very into my impressions. And I thought I'd go through a brief history of how I came to be interested in them. Right, let's begin at the beginning. I have a very weird voice. People are going, oh, it's a lovely British accent. No, this is weird for Britain. This is extremely weird for Britain. Nobody talks like this. Nobody has this kind of received pronunciation voice like mine. Unless they're particularly posh or particularly stupid. But no, the reason being, my father is, although he's North London origin, his father was an original Cockney, and my mother is from Yorkshire. So my voice is always going to be a weird mix, but at the same time I have Asperger's syndrome, which means it was hard enough sort of learning sort of basically learning how to talk and learning how to sort of keep talking and keep the flow going, let alone talk in a relatively sensible accent. So I have a weird voice to start with, and I don't particularly like the sound of my own voice. So doing impressions was something of a no-brainer. And it all started one Christmas, funnily enough. Yes, this all started one Christmas when our radio was tuned in to the Hancocks half-hour Christmas special, which was a repeat of a radio series from the 50s starring comedian Tony Hancock as an exaggerated version of himself. And this was something I believe Bob Newhart started in America, and it was something of a trend amongst comedians to have at this time. It was before really the sitcom took shape. And in some ways, Hancock's Half Hour is our first sitcom, although it's extremely surreal being a radio show and playing around with the laws of physics just occasionally, and just occasionally being very cartoony. But anyway, this episode was extremely good because it introduced me to a very interesting voice cast from Tony Hancock himself. It was a very difficult voice to imitate, and it was the Australian Bill Kerr, and he kept calling him Tab. He kept calling Hancock Tab because of the fact he was fat, but it was more an affectionate thing. There was Hattie Jakes as Griselda Pugh, the secretary, and they were constantly making jokes about her weight. Then we had Sid James as the kind of criminal friend element. And then Kenneth Williams filled in pretty much all the other voice parts. And Kenneth Williams always fascinated me because I genuinely thought there were different voices. It wasn't the same voice doing all these different characters until I started looking into it. Because you don't think from the copper with his perfect British copper voice is made popular by Dixon and Duck Green to grouchy old thing, and it was a really sort of a mostly as he's a drunk magistrate, as occasionally turned up, and then of course just occasionally you'd hear him come into the room and he'd do the snide character, what became known as the snide character. The snide character was this rather childlike utterly bonkers character who'd come in, oh hello, and he'd be some important role in the plot, but you wouldn't have expected him to be in. For example, one New Year special, it was, oh hello, I'm the pilot. Does anybody know how to fly a plane? Yeah, it was a lot of fun, but moving on from that, I got into various other shows, Round the Horn, which Williams was also involved in, with Kenneth Horne, Betty Marsden, Hugh Paddock, and Bill Pertwee. The Navy Lark, where I ran into my first experience of Leslie Phillips, the legend Leslie Phillips, who's been acting for about 78 years now, because he started at age 10. He's now 88. So yeah, he's a real badass. The other one that really influenced was the Goons. The Goons was kind of like a prototype for Monty Python's Flying Circus. It was written by Spike Milligan, who was considered he had various mental health problems in his life, and he was a very avant-garde comedian, and he created this rather insane comedy show that, again, it used radio's surreality and the way you could get away with images on the radio you couldn't otherwise. And most famously amongst those characters, they had two characters, Blue Bottle, and played by Peter Sellers, and Eccles. And Blue Bottle, played by Peter Sellers, with this little boy scared, and he always died in the end of the episode. Yes, that's where South Park got their gag from. That's where they nicked the Kenny gag from. It was from the Goons. And he's got a very large, very stupid best friend called Eccles. I'm Eccles. He's got this very strange voice, but it certainly sounds stupid. Yeah, but the thing is, there was loads of characters in that show. The only person playing only one voice in that show was Harry Seacombe, who was basically playing himself. And Harry Seacombe's got a very distinctive voice anyway, folks. Yes, he was actually an opera singer for a while. So Harry Seacombe's got this very strong voice. If I rule the world, sort of voice. It's very fun. He was also a very serious actor, as well as being very comical, like Milligan or Sellers. And one thing I found particularly funny was him playing Mr. Bumble and Oliver in the film version of Oliver, because he was doing Ryan Boy was new, he is going cheap. It was that kind of thing, and having heard this guy in the Goons, it was almost it almost made that rather sort of dramatic scene funny. And the same could be said of Leonard Rossiter as Mr. Sowbury, who was a big influence on me as well. Leonard Rossiter, he's got a bit of a slimmer. He was famous for two big shows, and those were Rising Damp, where he played a racist, sexist, homophobic, slightly deranged landlord who was basically selling renting out cut price rooms in this shitty old house, and constantly getting done over the rent and things like that. It was a farce, and it was supposed to be, and it was a lot of fun, and it sort of dealt sensitively with issues, whereas other shows like Love Thy Neighbour were just completely missing the point. That was contrasted by The Rise and Fall of Reggie Perrin, which was recently remade with Martin Clunes, and I think Martin Clunes is the wrong choice, because Martin Clunes is always so jolly, and having him play this rather depressed character just made no sense. And the whole, I mean, wow, how they ever came up with a sitcom that is based around a guy who is going to kill himself, then decides to fake his own death and come back as a distant cousin in the background of his life to see what would happen if he died. How you make that into a sitcom, that was genius. And I don't think, if they had cast Ronnie Barker as they intended to, I think that would have been a bit of a failure. I'm not saying Ronnie Barker is one of the greatest comedy actors we've ever had, from Fletcher in Porridge. You get me a couple of the Sun, would you? And something to read and all. To this is just to right, you know, it's with his stammer, but it's he was he I don't think he would have sort of carried it off quite as well as Leonard Rossiter did. So yeah, those are my sort of early British comedy influences. Yeah, other famous. I mean, pretty much everybody does things like "I'll be back" and all those sort of very typical Hollywood lines. We're going to make him an offer he can refuse, and that stuff. What I really love doing is picking up on the lines that aren't necessarily so meme-worthy. Like, for example, with Arnie. "Will you make it fast? My horse is getting tired." Yes, that's from a film called True Lies, where he's basically playing a James Bond character. And yes, it is a comedy. And it was always... Well, it wasn't originally intended to be a comedy, because it was originally intended to be a drama about a man who was so good at lying he'd actually not told his wife he was a secret agent for 15 years whilst they'd been married. And it was supposed to be a drama, then James Cameron rewrote it as a comedy and cast Schwarzenegger in the sort of spy role. And it was a stroke of genius, it really was. Especially that scene, which is got to be one of the craziest, not sure if serious chase scenes ever. Because it involves Arnold Schwarzenegger chasing a terrorist on a motorbike with a horse he nicked off a mounted police officer through a hotel. That sound good enough to you? Just go see it. Yeah, so that's the thing. I tend to pick up on lines that other people don't. Probably an Aspie thing again, but it's interesting one to look at, and particularly with Muppets, I find with the Muppets. They're easily imitable voices, because Kermit the Frog here is not too difficult to get your tongue around. And with Gonzo, you just gotta be really, really over the top and enthusiastic. And Rizzo, you gotta be skeptical. So you end up with something like this. "Good day to you, sirs. I am Charles Dickens, and I am Rizzo Lorette. Wait a second, you're not Charles Dickens. I am too. Look, Charles Dickens, a blue-furred Charles Dickens with a conky nose and who hangs out with a rat? Absolutely." Yeah, it's easy to know. And, of course... Miss Piggy's a fun one to do as well, because of the fact, obviously, she was originally voiced by Frank Oz, who also famous for voicing Yoda. So her voice was always going to be somewhat comical and somewhat like a pantomime dame. Just to explain that, pantomimes in this country are plays we have around Christmas time where actors take the piss out of conventions of theatre, like the fact theatre began with lots of audience participation and heckling and things like that. That's take the mickey out of. And usually the lead male character is played by a woman, and the sort of normally as a mother-like figure who's played by a man in drag. Yes, we're very weird here, but it is a lot of fun, and yeah, the Muppets do capture a lot of that tradition. And with Miss Piggy, it's not talking no more. It's kind of was they dumb or were they blind? That sounds exactly like a sort of a panto dame. When she that's from Love Letters Here from Muppet Treasure Island. When she does that song, it's particularly the way it screeches the high notes. The destiny seems way to serve. Yeah, that is just typical pantomime song stuff, which is not surprising really, as the Muppets started in Britain and were heavily influenced by British humour, including Spike Milligan. But yes, there's plenty of fun to be had with sort of your sort of mainstream film, and although I would recommend you not necessarily avoid the classics, your Peter Fool and I'll be back and all that stuff. Don't necessarily avoid them because they're good starting points, but do bear in mind everybody does them. So it really helps if you can work out something to do with those that's unusual, and if the current Doctor Who writers are anything to go by, there's nothing that you can put into an iconic voice put in an iconic voice that can sound weirder than has already been put on screen. Finally, my latest little obsessive interest, comic books. I find a lot of comic book characters a lot of fun to voice, and looking at the different interpretations from various actors, because even the most obscure comic book characters have been played by at least 2 or 3 actors now. Detective Chimps had 3 different voices, and that's just animated. So that's actually quite impressive for such an obscure character. But I tend to although I obviously I come up with voices that are more in line with what I do, I tend to focus on a lot of classic ones, and with the Penguin, of course, as you're well aware if you've seen the rest of my I've got a whole playlist of Penguin videos. The Penguin, I tend to go for the Burgess Meredith kind of one, because it involves a lot of hiss movement and over pronunciation of your words. It's a lot of fun to do that one, and more importantly, it's the origin of the Penguin ever having that, because of course Burgess Meredith was recovering from throat cancer. He was told to avoid cigarette smoke. Idiots cast him in a part that involved a cigarette holder and smoking off the cigarette holder, and he tried his best to keep the smoke from out of his throat, but just occasionally he'd screw up, and rather than have them retake the shot, he changed it into a just to sort of keep things moving, and it came about by accident, but now it's such an integral part of the character, people complain when it's not there. I mean, some people complain about the Arkham games where it not being there. It was there. It was there in the Arkham game. If you listen to him laughing, it is very much like that. It's a bit more, obviously it's a bit less pronounced, a bit more subtle, but it's there. Other characters, Batman himself, personally, my favourite Batman is Adam West, because of the fact that Adam West is the Batman as I've always seen Batman, this spoilt rich kid who's a bit of an idiot and is blundering around in spandex trying to solve crime. And I have a very Silver Age view of Batman himself. And Adam West did it perfectly, and Diedrich Bader, who did his voice in The Brave and the Bold, did a very good impression of West. In fact, it's funny, it's one of those things that one of the early episodes of Hancock that I listened to, Hancock was competing with a guy who was impersonating him. He was basically being a serious actor for once, and he was being impersonated by a guy doing cornflakes adverts, and this was harming his career. Now, this was actually something of an in-joke because of the fact that due to Hancock being ill, an entire series of it was actually filmed with Ronnie Barker doing his voice. And this was kept completely hush-hush, but it was Ronnie Barker doing Tony Hancock's voice. So it gave them a chance of these two Tony Hancocks to run into each other, which was kind of a fun little joke, particularly as they did sound almost exactly identical. And the final scene where they're actually arguing with each other is kind of cool. And Sid actually says he does sound a bit more like you than you do. And there's several instances where that's happened. I think Diedrich Bader's Batman's one, Tom Kenny's Penguin, as opposed to the Burgess Meredith Penguin, although the Burgess Meredith Penguin is the original. I think Tom Kenny basically does Burgess Meredith's voice better than he does. Then that happens a lot with comic books, particularly when you get voices of the animated ones in the games, which I think is probably why Nolan North decided to do that ridiculous Cockney accent. I think there's plenty of room for it, because of course they're from a written medium. There's plenty of room for interpretation, with the exception of Harley Quinn, who was invented for the animated series and has always been associated with that really squeaky voice. Oh, Mr. J, that poor little thing. That sort of squeaky voice, which is easily imitable, and it is a key part of her character. So that's difficult to. It's like the Penguin's whack. You've got to have it in there somewhere, and you got to. But it's more restricting than the Penguin's whack in some ways, because the Penguin's whack could be part of a posh voice, sort of thing, or it could be part of the sort of Cockney Yorkshire mix weird thing that Nolan North did, with that he did. Or it could be a full-on Burgess Meredith. So it's still there, whatever it is. But with Harley, there's less room for manoeuvre. And in some ways it's a good thing, some ways it's a bad thing. But everybody else, there's so much variation in how people... I mean, Gorilla Grodd, one of my favourite underrated supervillains, who isn't actually a Batman villain. I'll have to do one of the non-Batman villains, because he's a lot of fun. He's a psychic gorilla. How can that not be fun? But you have the people who just play it straight and just read him like anything. I think they're boring. And the guy from Justice League Unlimited did that. It's just so boring. It's just not funny. Whereas it's just not the character. He's got to be a gorilla. He's got to sound gorilla, right? The guy in The Brave and the Bold did a very good job, but the guy I think that nails it is the chap in DC Universe Online. Surrender a planet that by rights belongs to me. I'm Grodd. It's just it's both epic and extremely stupid, which I think comic books need a lot more of. So yeah, that's my history of doing silly voices, a few of them in example. I've probably got a lot more, it's just that I'm out of practice. I'm trying to get back into the whole thing recently, with having a YouTube channel, having this review show on Blip that used to be on YouTube, but then YouTube decided not to understand the terms fair use, so I had to move to Blip. Another story. But yeah, it is it's just a lot of fun doing voices, and thank you for your video, Michael. Look forward to seeing more in the future, and yes, it does help just to occasionally have some fun.